Della Mercer stood in the dust of the Bent Fork Road with a carpet-bag in one hand and a folded paper in the other, and the three men who had brought her there looked at her broad shoulders and her heavy arms, and decided out loud that she would not last the month. Her worth would not be measured by the near 280 pounds she carried on her broad frame, but by what she could lift, mend, and refuse to let fall. The wagon that had hauled her the last 40 miles from the railhead at Cordell creaked away behind her, and the driver did not look back. He had been paid in advance to deliver one widow to the Hollis ranch, and to ask no questions about why a man drowning in notes would send for a wife at all. Della had asked the questions herself silently the whole long ride, and she had no good answers, only the paper in her hand and the name written across the top of it in a clerk's tight, mean little script. Silas Hollis, of the Lazy H, Owing. She had been a widow for 14 months. Tom Mercer had been a freighter, a kind man with bad lungs, and he had left her a debt of his own and a one-room house in Cordell that the bank took back before the ground over him had settled. When the letter came from a land agent named Pruitt, offering her passage west and a roof and a place at a man's table if she would marry him and keep his house, she had read it 4 times by lamplight and understood every word of what it did not say. A man who would send for a stranger by post was a man no woman within 50 miles would have. A man who would take a heavy widow with empty pockets was a man with nothing left to be choosy about. That suited her. She had stopped expecting to be chosen a long time ago. If you have ever stood somewhere you were not wanted and decided to be useful anyway, stay with me to the end, because Della's story does not go the way the men in this telling believed it would. And do me one kindness as you settle in. Drop the name of your town in the comments so I can see just how far this story travels tonight. Now let me bring you to the gate of the Lazy H, where a tall man was standing in the doorway of a sagging house, watching a fat stranger come up his road and counting, behind his still face, all the ways she would cost him. His name was Silas Hollis, and he was 38 years old, and he had buried a wife and a brother in the same year and had not smiled at anyone since. He was lean the way a man gets when the work outpaces the food, with a short dark beard going gray at the jaw and eyes the flat brown of creek water in August. He wore a brown wide-brim hat, sweated dark at the band, a faded vest, a cream work shirt gone soft and thin at the elbows, and a revolver on his hip that he had not fired at a living thing in 2 years. He watched Della come, and he did not move to help her with the bag. "You're the Mercer woman?" he said. It was not a question. "I am," Della said. "You're Mr. Hollis." "I am." He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he suspects of being sold sick. His eyes went over her wide hips and her thick arms and the soft round of her belly under the travel-dusted blue dress, and Della watched him do the arithmetic that every man did, the same sum, the same answer. He looked past her at the empty road. "Pruitt said you'd bring a trunk." "Pruitt said a great many things." She set the carpet-bag down in the dust. "I brought what I own. It fits in the one bag." Something moved behind his flat eyes and was gone. He stepped back from the door. "There's a room at the end of the hall. The roof leaks over it. Supper's whatever you find. I'll be in the south field till dark." He paused on the porch step, his hat brim throwing his face into shadow, and said the thing he had decided to say on the long ride to his own decision. "I sent for a wife because I need hands, not a guest. You understand that." "I understood it from the letter." Della said. "I'll have supper on when you come in." He looked at her one more time, and she saw it land, the small surprise, the suspicion of it, and then he went down toward the south field without another word. Della picked up her bag and went inside, and what she found in that house told her more about Silas Hollis than he would have told her in a year. The front room had not been swept since the snow went off. There were 2 chairs and a table with a split top, a cold stove with a week of ash banked in it, and over the mantel a daguerreotype of a young woman in a wedding collar. The glass cracked corner to corner. The kitchen shelf held a sack of flour gone to weevils, a half a side of salt pork green at the edge, a tin of coffee, and nothing else a person could call food. There was a butter churn dry as a bone, and a milk pail with a hole rusted through the bottom. And on the table by the cold stove, where another man might keep his Bible, there was a stack of papers held down by a river stone, and Della, who had buried one man's debt already, knew exactly what they were before she lifted the stone. She made herself read every one of them by the gray window light. The Lazy H owed $1,140. It owed it to the Cattlemen's Bank of Cordell, to a feed and grain man named Ostrander, and to a freight account in town. And the bank's note was due in full by the 1st of October, or the land went to auction on the courthouse steps. It was the 9th of June. Della counted the weeks on her fingers the way her mother had taught her to count anything she was afraid of, slowly, so the fear could not run ahead of her. 16 weeks. $1,140 in 16 weeks, off a ranch, with a hole in its only milk pail. She folded the papers back under the stone exactly as she had found them. Then she rolled the weevily flour out onto a cloth, picked the bugs from it grain by grain because there was nothing else to bake with, fed the stove from the cold wood box, and by the time Silas Hollis came up from the south field in the long gold light, there was cornbread in the iron skillet, and the salt pork was frying with the green cutaway, and the front room had been swept down to the boards. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the swept floor and the warm stove, and the woman bent over his cold supper, turning it hot. And he said nothing at all, which, from Silas Hollis, Della would learn, was a kind of astonishment. He ate 2 helpings standing up. When he set the plate down, he looked at her across the lamp. "You read the papers," he said. "I did." "Then you know what you married into." "I know it down to the dollar," Della said. $1,140 due the 1st of October. His jaw worked. "You can leave. Pruitt'll carry you back to the rail. I won't hold a woman to a sinking thing." Della scraped the last of the cornbread into his plate and set it in front of him again. "I've sunk before, Mr. Hollis," she said. "I know how to swim out. Eat your supper." He ate it. And that night, in the leaking room at the end of the hall, Della Mercer lay awake and did not count the leaks. She counted the weeks, and the dollars, and the things she knew how to do, and for the first time in 14 months, she felt the old thing wake in her, the stubborn animal thing that had carried her through worse, and it was almost like being glad. The first proof came on the 4th morning, and it came out of the barn. Silas had a milk cow named Bess, a roan shorthorn gone dry and gaunt, and a heiferin calf that he had been counting on to drop a healthy calf he could sell in the fall. The heifer went down in the night. Della heard her bawling before light, and was out across the yard in her shawl with a lantern, while Silas was still pulling his boots, and she was already kneeling in the straw with her sleeves shoved up to her heavy elbows when he came through the barn door. "She's turned wrong," Della said, not looking up. "Calf's comin' hind end, and one leg's hung back. Hold the lantern." "You've calved cattle," Silas said. It was the second question he had asked her. That was not a question. "I was raised on a milk farm in the Mohawk Valley, Mr. Hollis. I've pulled more calves than you've branded." She had her arm in the heifer to the shoulder, her broad face calm, her eyes somewhere far off the way a person's eyes go when their hands are doing the seeing. "There, I have the leg. When she pushes, you pull when I say and not before. Steady now, steady." The heifer heaved. Della found the hocks, hooked them with the loop of soft rope she'd had the sense to bring from the tack peg, and called the pull. And Silas Hollis, who had been certain 4 days ago that this woman would cost him everything, hauled on a rope beside her, with the sweat running down into his beard, and a black calf slid wet and steaming into the straw and shook its head and lived. Della cleared its nose with her thumb and rubbed it down with a sack until it bawled. The heifer turned and began to lick it. Silas stood holding the slack rope and looking at the calf that was worth by October somewhere near $12 on the hoof, and at the woman kneeling in the bloody straw who had just put it on the ground. "That calf dies, you're out $12, Della said, getting to her feet with a hand on the stall rail, breathing hard. "It lives, you're 1,128 to the clear instead of 1,140. I'd keep it alive." Silas looked at her a long moment. 1,128, he repeated, as if he were testing whether she had really done the sum in her head while her arm was inside a cow. "I keep count," Della said. "It's the only way I know to stay ahead of a thing this size." She wiped her arm on the sack and looked at him plainly. "You've been losing because you've been grieving, and a grieving man can't count. I'm not grieving your wife, Mr. Hollis. I can count for both of us till you're able again." It was the boldest thing she had said to him, and she watched it cost her nothing, because he did not flinch from it. He looked at the cracked place in himself that she had named out loud, and then he looked at the living calf, and he said, in a voice rougher than he meant, "There's a hole in the milk pail." "I saw it," Della said. "I'll solder it today if you got a pot of resin and a hot iron. Then Bess can be brought back into milk if we feed her right, and milk and butter is money in town every Saturday." She picked up her lantern. 1,128. We start there." That was the morning the ranch turned, though neither of them named it. From that day, Della Mercer ran the Lazy H like a woman bailing a boat, and the boat began, grudgingly, to ride higher. The milk pail was the next morning's work, and she made Silas watch, because a marriage built on a debt needed at least one of the two to know what the other could do. She set the hold pail on the porch boards in the early light, scraped the rust ring bright with the back of her knife, cut a coin of tin from the lid of the empty coffee can, and laid it over the hole. Then she heated the soldering iron she had found in a drawer of broken things in the kitchen until the tip ran blue, touched it to a stick of resin and a curl of solder, and tinned the patch down tight, blowing the smoke away from her face, her broad hands sure and unhurried. "There," she said, and poured a dipper of water into the pail and held it up to the sun, and not a drop wept through. "A pail's $1 in town, and we don't have $1, so we mend the one with a hole. That's how the whole summer's gonna go, Mr. Hollis. We mend what's holed, and we sell what we can, and we count it every night, so the Count never gets ahead of us." She set the pail down. "Now, Bess, your cow's not dry by nature. She's dry by neglect. Show me the hay." The hay was poor, a few forkfuls of last year's grass gone musty in the loft, and Della clicked her tongue at it and went looking, and found, behind the barn where Silas in his grief had stopped looking, a half-bushel of bran that the mice had only begun on. She wet it warm with a little molasses scraped from a near-empty jug, and carried it to the gaunt roan cow in a clean bucket, and Bess, who had not been fed a kind thing in a year, put her head into it and ate like a creature remembering what it was for. "You bring a cow back the way you bring a person back," Della said, standing in the stall with her hand on the cow's hollow flank. "Slow and warm and every day, and you don't let her see you're worried. 3 weeks and she'll milk. Mark it." She marked it true. She soldered the milk pail with resin and a hot iron and a strip of tin, cut from an old coffee can, and it held. She brought the dry cow back with bran mash and good grass and patience, and inside 3 weeks, to the day, Bess was giving over a gallon a day. The hens came back the same way the cow had. There were 9 of them, ragged and shy, hiding in the brush along the creek because something had been at the coop, and Silas had not had the heart to mend it. Della spent an evening on her knees in the chicken house, with a hammer and a fistful of bent nails. She had straightened on a stone, closing the gaps a fox could come through, and she scattered the floor with the picked weevils from the flour and the scraps off the table, and crooned to the hens the low nonsense her grandmother had crooned, and within 4 days they had come in off the creek of their own accord, and within a week they were laying in the nest boxes she had lined with clean straw. The first morning she gathered 8 brown eggs into her apron. She carried them up to the house and set them on the table in front of Silas without a word. 8 eggs where there had been none. And Silas looked at the eggs and looked at her and said, "I'd given up on those birds." And Della said, "Most things come back if you stop giving up on them in front of them. Birds especially. Birds can tell." The leaking room at the end of the hall was the next thing she mended, and she mended it herself, because she had learned not to wait for a grieving man to climb to a roof. There had been a hard rain the 3rd night, and she had lain in the dark, listening to it run down the wall and pool on the floorboards. And in the morning, while Silas was at the south field, Della carried the ladder around to the back of the house, hauled her own broad self up onto the shingle roof, one slow, careful rung at a time, and found the trouble, a span of split cedar shakes where a limb had come down in some old storm and never been seen to. She had no new shakes, so she did what her father had done in a lean year. She pulled good shakes from the lee side of the barn where 3 could be spared, and nailed them up over the split ones, and she tarred the seams with pine pitch she had boiled down on the stove. And by the time Silas came up from the field, there was a fat woman sitting on the peak of his roof against the evening sky, hammering, and he stood in the yard and looked up at her, and could not for the life of him think of a single thing to say. "It won't leak now," Della called down. "Come hold the ladder so I don't break my neck getting off it. It's a long way down for a woman my size." And Silas held the ladder and steadied her broad foot to the rung with his own hand, careful as if she were made of glass. And when she was down safe in the yard, they stood close a moment in the last of the light, and she was filthy with pitch, and he smelled of horse and cut hay, and neither of them moved. And then Bess lowed for her milking, and the moment let them go. That night Della cooked the supper that broke him, though she had not set out to break anything but his bad habit of eating standing up. She had traded 2 pounds of her butter at the mercantile that week for a soup bone and a few onions and a paper of dried apples, and she made a beef and barley soup thick enough to stand a spoon in, and biscuits that came out of the oven golden high, and a dried apple pandoti with the last of the molasses. And she set it on the table she had scrubbed white, and she made Silas Hollis sit down at it like a man at his own table and not a stranger passing through his own kitchen. He ate 3 bowls of the soup and 4 biscuits and a square of the pandoti, and somewhere in the middle of it he stopped, with the spoon halfway up, and his eyes went strange, and Della saw the grief come up in him all at once, and had the grace to look down at her own plate and let him have it private. Ruth used to. He started and stopped and started again. Nobody's cooked a real supper in this house in 2 years. I forgot what it was. I forgot a house could smell like this. He set the spoon down. I'm sorry. I don't mean to. You don't apologize to me for missing your wife, Della said quietly, still not looking up, giving him the room. Not ever. A man who didn't grieve a good woman wouldn't be worth the cooking for. You eat your supper, Silas, and you miss her all you need to, and the soup'll still be warm. There's no hurry in this kitchen. And Silas Hollis ate his supper, with the tears standing in his eyes and not falling, and it was the first meal in 2 years he had tasted, and the count of the things this woman had given him that no money could measure began that night, though he did not have a slate for that kind of count. Della churned the cream to butter and pressed it into a mold with a sheaf of wheat carved in the bottom the way her mother had, and on Saturday she rode into Bent Fork on the buckboard beside Silas with a basket of yellow butter and a basket of brown eggs from the hens she had coaxed back to laying by cleaning the coop and feeding them the leavings, and she sold every ounce and every egg before noon. Bent Fork was the kind of frontier town that had one of everything and 2 of nothing: 1 church, 1 bank, 1 feed store, 1 saloon, a livery, a land office, and a mercantile run by a sharp-faced woman named Ada Foss, who knew everyone's business and minded most of it. The men on the bench outside the mercantile watched Della climb down off the buckboard, and one of them, a big, loud cattleman named Cyrus Vane, who ran the biggest spread in the valley and held more notes than the bank did, said it loud enough to carry. Hollis went and bought himself a wife by the pound, Vane said, and the bench laughed. Della heard it. She had heard it her whole life, in barnyards and church porches and the doorways of better houses than this. She set her butter basket on Ada Foss's counter and counted it out. 12 pounds at 15 cents, $1.80, and 4 dozen eggs at a dime, the dozen 40 cents. And she said to Ada Foss in a level voice, $2.20, and I'll take it in cash, not credit. Then she turned around on the porch and looked Cyrus Vane full in his red face. By the pounds, the only honest way to buy anything, Mr. Vane, she said. It's how you buy beef. I expect it's how the bank will buy your land, too, when your time comes. And she climbed back up onto the buckboard with her $2.20 and left him to the silence on the bench, which was a great deal louder than the laughing had been. Silas drove them out of town without a word, but a mile down the road, where the cottonwoods threw their shade across the ruts, she saw the corner of his mouth move under the beard just once, and pull flat again. "Vane holds my freight note," he said. $110 of it. "Then we'll pay Vane first," Della said, "so you never have to take your hat off to him again." She set the $2.20 into the tin she had started keeping under the loose board by the stove. $1,128, less what the butter and eggs'll bring every week. Call it $1.50 a week, clear off the dairy near enough. It's slow. It's not nothing. "It's not enough," Silas said. "No," Della agreed. "The dairy's the small money, the cattle's the big money, and the big money's all in October. We keep the herd alive and fat till the drive, and we sell what we don't need to keep, and that's where the 1,100 comes from. The dairy just keeps us eating while we wait." She looked out at his thin, gaunt cattle scattered on the overgrazed flat. "How many head?" 61, Silas said. "Was 90. I sold 30 in the spring to make the May interest." Della did the sum and did not say it aloud, but Silas, who was beginning to learn the woman he had married, saw her do it. 61 head and a fall market that paid, in a good year, $18 to $22 on a finished steer, but only 12 on a thin one, and these were thin. The difference between a fat steer and a thin one was the difference between keeping the ranch and losing it, and the difference between a fat steer and a thin one was grass and water through a dry July and August, and it was the 9th of June, and the creek was already low. "You've got a water problem," Della said. Silas looked at her sharply. "How'd you come to that?" "Because your grass is grazed to the dirt near the house and belly high a mile off, which means your cattle won't walk to the far grass, which means there's no water out there to walk to. They stay where the creek is, and they eat it bare." She had seen it from the buckboard, plain as a printed page. "A man grieving can't see his own ground. Show me the far quarter tomorrow, and I'll show you your water." He showed her the far quarter the next morning, the dry northeast corner where the good grass stood untouched, and Della walked it slow in the heat with her heavy tread, reading the lay of the land the way her father had taught her, following the green. She found it by noon, a seep at the foot of a clay bank where the grass grew rankest and the ground stayed dark, an underground trickle that wept out and sank back into the dirt before it could ever make a pool. "There's your water," she said, kneeling and pressing her broad hand into the wet ground. "It's here. It just won't stand. We dig it out, line a tank with clay and flat stone, and the seep fills it, and the cattle come to the far grass to drink, and they graze the grass you're not using, and they get fat for free." She looked up at him in the white sun. "How's that for a grieving woman's eyes?" Silas Hollis crouched down beside her and put his own hand in the wet ground, and Della watched him understand that a stranger off the train had walked his land for one morning and found the thing that could save it, the thing he had walked past in his grief for a year. "We'll need to dig it by hand," he said. "I can't hire it. There's no money to hire it." "There's two of us," Della said, and stood and brushed the clay from her skirts. "I've got a strong back, and you've got a strong back. We'll dig it ourselves." And they did. For 9 days, in the worst of the June heat, Della Mercer and Silas Hollis dug a stock tank out of a clay bank with a spade and a mattock and a stone boat to haul the rock. And it was a kind of work that breaks people, and it did not break her. She dug in her oldest blue dress with her sleeves rolled and her bun coming down in flower-pale strings, her broad back bent, her heavy arms swinging the mattock in a steady rhythm that never sped and never stopped. And when Silas, lean as he was, had to climb out of the pit to breathe in the shade, Della kept digging. By the fourth day, he had stopped offering to take the heavy end of the stone boat from her. By the seventh, he had started bringing the water jug to her first. It was on the sixth evening of the digging, when they sat in the cooling dusk at the lip of the half-dug pit, too tired to walk to the house, that Silas Hollis told her about his brother, and it came out of him sideways the way the true things do. He had turned over a flat creek stone in the spoil and found a fish hook rusted into it, an old hand-forged hook, and he sat looking at it in his dirty palm. "This was Caleb's," he said, "my brother. He set trot lines along the creek when we were boys before the war, before any of this was ours. He turned the hook over. He bought this land with his soldiers' money and his freighting money, and he wrote me to come help him work it, and I came, and we did well for 2 years. Then the fever came through in the same winter, 18 and 86, and it took Caleb in the December, and it took my wife Ruth in the January, 4 weeks between them, and I buried them up on the rise under the lone cottonwood." He closed his hand on the hook. "I've been digging in the wrong place for 2 years, Della. I've been digging my own grave next to theirs, an inch at a time, and I didn't have the sense to stop until you came and put a spade in my hand and showed me a hole worth digging." Della did not name his grief for him, because the channel of her own heart had taught her that grief named too quick by another's mouth only closes up harder. She reached over and took the rusted hook from his palm and looked at it. "Then we'll keep the hook," she said, "not for sorrow. For the boy who set trot lines on a creek he loved enough to buy. Put it in the box with the papers, Silas. A house ought to keep 1 or 2 things that aren't worth a cent." She handed it back. "And tomorrow we finish the tank, and the creek your brother loved goes to watering your cattle and saving your land, which I expect would suit him better than a rusty hook in a strong-box would, but we keep them both." He put the hook in the box with the papers that night, next to the deed and the debt and the scrap of red glove that would come later, and he did not say anything more, but in the morning he was at the pit before she was, and he had brought the water jug, and he handed it to her first. By the 9th day they tamped the last flat stone into the clay lining and stood back, filthy to the eyes, and watched the seep begin, drop by drop, to fill the tank they had cut out of the dry ground. That evening Silas Hollis did a thing he had not done in 2 years. At supper, with the dust still in the creases of his hands, he looked across the lamp at the heavy woman who had dug a well with him in the heat, and he said, "Della," just her name. He had not used it before. He had called her the Mercer woman, and you, and nothing. "Yes," Della said. "Nothing," he said, and looked down at his plate and ate. But she had heard it, and she carried it down the hall to the leaking room and held it like a warm coal all night. There was a Sunday in the middle of all that digging and selling and counting that Della Near did not go into town for, because she knew what waited for her at the Bent Fork Church, and it was not the preaching. She went anyway, in her one good dress, the deep purple one she had married Tom Mercer in and buried him in, and now wore to face down a town in, because she would not give them the satisfaction of her hiding. She and Silas sat in a back pew, and after the service, in the churchyard where the women gathered under the cottonwoods with their pies and their gossip, Della carried her own offering to the table, a dried apple pie with a lattice top, the best pie in the yard by any honest mouth's reckoning, and set it down among the others. And the talk stopped the way talk stops when the thing being talked about walks up. It was a banker's wife named Mrs. Lanier who said it, a thin, sharp woman in store-bought lace who had never lifted a thing heavier than a teacup. She looked at Della's pie and then at Della and said, "Sweet as poison," loud enough for the circle. "My, what a large pie! But then I suppose you know all about large, wouldn't you, Mrs. Hollis? They do say Silas Hollis bought you by the hundredweight." And the women tittered behind their hands the way women do when one of them throws a stone and they want the warmth of it without the throwing. Della Mercer stood very still over her pie. She had 100 answers, and most of them were cruel, and all of them were true, and she let every one of them go, because she had learned a thing in 40 years that Mrs. Lanier in her store-bought lace had never had to learn, that the woman who answers cruelty with cruelty has agreed to the contest, and the woman who answers it with grace has refused it, and refusing it is the only way to win it. "It's a dried apple pie, Mrs. Lanier," Della said pleasantly, cutting it as she spoke, lifting a clean slice onto a plate with the flat of her knife. "My mother's recipe. There's nutmeg in it, and a little cider in the apples, and the lattice is cut narrow, so the steam comes through and the bottom doesn't go to paste. It is a large pie, you're right, because I made it large enough to feed everyone here, the kind as well as the unkind, since a pie can't tell the difference, and neither, on a Sunday, should I." She held the plate out to Mrs. Lanier with both hands and the warmest smile in the churchyard. "You'll have the first slice. I'd be honored." And Mrs. Lanier, trapped by her own lace and the whole circle watching, had no choice in front of the Lord and the cottonwoods but to take the slice of pie from the fat woman she had just insulted and eat it, and it was the best pie she had ever put in her mouth, and everyone there knew it, and the cruelty curdled in her, and the grace sweetened in Della. And that was the Sunday the women of Bent Fork began, one by one, against their own first judgment, to come around. By the time the drought drove their husbands' cattle to Della's well, the wives had already half changed their minds in a churchyard over a slice of dried apple pie, and a town turns the way its kitchens turn. But if the women began to soften, the men who had wagered against her did not, and one man least of all. The town did not soften the way Silas did, not at first, and not all of it ever. It got worse before it got better, because part of the town had bet against her, and nothing makes a man crueler than watching the thing he wagered on start to win. It was Cyrus Vane who carried it. Vane had wanted the Lazy H land for 3 years, for the water rights on the creek that ran through it, water that fed Vane's own bottom land downstream, and Vane had been content to wait for Silas Hollis to drown in his own debt and then buy the land for the price of the notes on the courthouse steps. In October, a fat butter-selling widow was not part of Cyrus Vane's plan, and Cyrus Vane was not a man who let a plan be spoiled by a woman he could buy and sell 10 times over. He came out to the Lazy H on a Sunday afternoon in the last week of June on a tall blood-bay horse, with 2 of his hands behind him, and he found Della in the garden she had spaded out of the sod east of the house, on her knees in the dirt, setting out cabbage and turnip and squash for the fall. He did not get down off his horse. "Mrs. Hollis," Vane said, looking down at her from the saddle, taking up the whole sky, "I've come to make your husband a Christian offer, but he's not to home, so I'll make it to you, since they tell me you're the one runs the figures now." He smiled with all his teeth. $300 cash for the deed. He keeps nothing, but he walks away owing nothing, which is more than he'll have come October. You're a sensible woman by the size of you. Talk sense to him. Della sat back on her heels in the garden dirt and looked up at Cyrus Vane on his tall horse, and she did not get up, because a woman on her knees in her own garden owes no man the courtesy of standing. "The deed," she said. "The deed," Vane said. "His land that the creek runs through, the creek that waters your bottom land all summer." Della pulled a cabbage start from the flat and set it gently in the hole she dug and pressed the soil around it with her broad thumbs. "You don't want the land, Mr. Vane. You want the water. You've wanted it 3 years, and you've been waiting for Mr. Hollis to die of grief so you could buy his water for the price of his sorrow." She set the next cabbage. $300 for $1,100 of land and a creek you'd pay $3,000 for if you had to. That's not a Christian offer. That's a thief's offer, made in church clothes. Cyrus Vane's red face went redder. "You watch your mouth, woman." "I've watched it 40 years, Della said, "and it's never once said anything as ugly as what you just rode out here to say." She stood up then, slowly brushing the dirt from her knees, and standing, she was nearly as tall as Vane was high on his horse, broad and dusty and entirely unafraid. "You tell me the figure that buys the deed, and I'll tell you why we'll have it cleared ourselves by the 1st of October. 1140 when I came, 1128 when the calf lived that you didn't think would, 1109 this morning after the butter and the eggs. It only goes one way, Mr. Vane, down. You can ride out here every Sunday and watch it go down if it pleases you, but it's going to be at 0 on the 1st of October, and the water's going to stay where it is." For a moment, Cyrus Vane could not find his voice. He was a man who had been agreed with his whole life, who paid men to agree with him, and a fat widow on her knees in a turnip patch had just laid his whole soul out in the dirt in front of his own 2 hands, and the hands were looking very fixedly at their saddle horns. "You think you're clever," Vane said at last, low and ugly. "A clever fat woman. I've broke clever men. I've broke this whole valley to my hand 1 note at a time. And I'll break a sodbuster's mail-order cow of a wife without losing a night's sleep." He leaned down over his saddle horn. "You know what you are? You're a thing a desperate man bought cheap to work himself out of a hole. And when the hole takes him under anyway, you'll go back on the train you came on, by the pound, the way you came. That's your worth, Mrs. Hollis, a freight rate." Della set the last cabbage start in its hole and pressed the earth around it and stood, slow, and brushed her broad hands clean down her apron and looked Cyrus Vane in the eye from the ground where she had every right to stand. "I've been weighed by better men than you and priced by worse," she said, without heat, "and not one of them ever once guessed what I was actually worth, because they were all of them doing the same lazy sum you're doing, looking at the size of a thing and thinking that's the measure of it. You look at me and see freight. Mr. Hollis looked at me the same way in June." She nodded toward the south field. "But Mr. Hollis has had the sense to learn in 3 months, the thing you'll never learn in your whole rich life, that you can't tell what's inside a barrel by how heavy it is to lift. Sometimes the heavy barrel's full of nails, and sometimes it's full of seed." She picked up her trowel. "You've ridden out here to frighten me, and you found out I don't frighten, so I'd ride home now if I were you, before you teach my whole garden how small you are. Good day, Mr. Vane." For a moment, Cyrus Vane could not find his voice a second time. Then he yanked his horse's head around and said, over his shoulder, "The thing men like him always say when a woman has out-talked them. We'll see how that fat mouth talks come October. There's a long, dry summer between here and your zero, Mrs. Hollis. A lot can happen to a herd in a dry summer." And he rode off with his two hands, and the way he said it, the particular flat threat in it, stayed in the garden after he was gone, like a smell. Della knelt back down and finished setting her cabbages. But she had heard the threat, and she set a watch in her own mind from that hour, because she had learned long ago that a man who tells you a thing can happen to your herd is a man telling you he means to make it happen. It happened on a moonless night in the second week of July, and it happened the way Vane meant it to look, like an accident. Della woke to the wrong silence, not the silence of night, which is full of crickets and the creak and the soft stamp of stock, but a held silence, the silence of animals that have gone still and afraid. She was at the window before she was fully awake, and she smelled it before she saw it. Smoke, dry grass smoke, and under it the hot animal smell of a herd beginning to bunch and mill. Down on the dark flat between the house and the creek, a line of orange was running through the dry June grass toward the bedded cattle, and it was running with the small, even quickness of a fire that had been set. 3 or 4 little fires walking together in a line the wind would join into one. She did not waste a breath waking Silas with words. She hit his door with the flat of her hand and shouted the only two that mattered. "Fire! The herd!" And she was already pulling her boots on and grabbing the wet feed sacks off the line, soaked from the wash she had hung that evening, the one piece of luck in the whole black night. Silas came out buttoning nothing, his revolver in his hand and his face white. "Vane," he said, "Vane later, cattle now." Della was already running, heavy and fast, down toward the fire line with the wet sacks bundled against her chest. The fire's between them and the creek. They'll run the wrong way into the wire and break their legs and pile up. We turn them. You go wide and left and crack that gun in the air and turn the lead. I'll beat the line out where it's thin before it joins. It was a plan made in 4 seconds by a woman who had thought weeks ago on her knees in a garden about exactly what a man like Vane might do to a herd in a dry summer, and had let herself imagine it so that when it came she would not have to think, only move. And she moved. Della Mercer waded into a grass fire in her nightdress and boots, with a wet feed sack in each hand, and beat the running flame the way you beat a rug, hard and flat and steady, killing it in the thin places before the little fires could marry into a wall, and the heat scorched her arms and the smoke tore her lungs, and she did not stop, because the herd was 61 head, and 61 head was the ranch, and the ranch was the deed, and the deed was the only thing she had left to be proven right about. Out on the dark left, Silas's revolver cracked once, twice, 3 times, and Della heard the lead cattle balk and bawl and turn, heard the whole bunched mass of them swing away from the wire and the fire and pour back up the safe slope toward the house, their hooves a thunder she felt in the ground through her boots. The fire, robbed of the dry corridor she had beaten out of it, guttered and crawled and died in the trampled wet where she had broken it, and the night came back, full of smoke, and the bawling of frightened cattle, and the smell of singed grass, and Della Mercer stood in the black with 2 charred feed sacks hanging from her blistered hands, and counted the cattle as they passed her on the slope, out loud, in a cracked voice until she had counted 61. 61. Not one lost, not one in the wire. Silas found her there in the dark and the smoke, swaying on her feet, her arms burned and her nightdress scorched, and he took her by the shoulders the way no one had taken her by the shoulders in 14 months, and he said her name like it was the only word he knew. "Della, Della, are you burned? Let me see. Let me see your hands." "They're all here," Della said, not about her hands. 61. I counted them twice. He didn't get one. And then her knees went, and Silas Hollis caught a fat, blistered widow against his chest in a burned field at midnight and held her up. And that was the night the thing between them stopped being a bargain and became the other thing, the thing neither of them had let themselves want. He carried the lamp while she sat at the kitchen table, and he knelt in front of her and dressed her burned hands himself, clumsy and careful, with lard and clean rag, and neither of them said much, because there are nights when saying it would be too large for the room. But when he tied off the last strip of rag, Silas Hollis looked up at her from where he knelt, and he said, "Lo, I sent for a pair of hands. I didn't know I was sending for the best of anybody I ever met." "You couldn't have known," Della said. "Nobody ever does. I'm a thing people have to find out by accident." She looked down at her bandaged hands and his. "You found me out faster than most." They did not sleep that night, either of them. Della's hands hurt too much for sleep, and Silas would not leave her at the table alone, so they sat across the lamp through the small hours with the smell of smoke, still in their clothes, and somewhere in the dark before dawn, Silas got up and took the banknote off the top of the stack of papers under the river stone, the cruel printed notice that said the Lazy H owed $1,140 by the 1st of October, and he looked at it a long while in the lamplight. "I used to read this every night," he said, "like Scripture, like if I read it enough, it'd tell me how to pay it. I'd read it and grieve and read it again." He set it down. "I haven't read it once since you came. You don't read it. You just pay it down $1 at a time and write the new number on a slate and never look at the old one." "Because the old number's a dead thing and the new one's alive," Della said. "You don't keep weighing a man on the day he died. You count what's left living and you feed it." She nodded at the notice. "That paper says what we owed. It doesn't say what we are. When it's paid, I mean to keep it, though. Do you know that? I mean to keep that ugly notice in the box forever." "Why in the world would you keep it?" Silas said. "Because a thing that nearly drowned you is worth keeping once you've swum out," Della said. "So you can take it out on an easy winter night 10 years from now and remember you were once $1,140 and a whole town's mockery from the bottom, and you climbed out anyway, the two of you, $1 and a calf and a pie at a time. That paper's going to be the dearest thing in that box some day, Silas, dearer than the deed, because the deed only says you own the land. The notice'll say you earned it." She turned the bandaged backs of her hands up to the lamp. "Now, read me the number on the slate, since my hands won't write tonight, and we'll go on." He read her the number on the slate, and the man who had read a debt notice every night like Scripture put it back in the box and never read it in grief again. In the morning, they walked the burned ground together in the gray light, and Della found what she had known they would find. At the upwind edge of the burn, where the fires had been started, there were boot tracks in the soft creek mud, 3 sets, come up from the creek and gone back down it, and snagged on the lowest strand of the wire fence a torn scrap of leather glove, ox blood red, the kind of fine red leather glove that no working hand in the valley owned, the kind of glove a rich man wears to look like a working man. Silas turned the scrap over in his fingers. "Vain," he said. "Vain," Della agreed. "But a scrap of glove isn't proof a judge will hang a man on. He'll say a hand of his lost it months ago. He'll say the fire was lightning, though there wasn't a cloud. He'll say 100 things, and he'll be believed because he's the biggest man in the valley, and we're a thin rancher and a fat stranger." She closed his fingers over the red scrap. "Keep it anyway. A thing like this has a way of mattering later, even when it doesn't matter now. Put it in the box with the papers." He put it in the box with the papers, and the count went on. Because a fire does not pay a bank, and the 1st of October does not move for any man's grief or any woman's burns. 1109, the morning of the fire. By the 3rd week of July, it was 1090, because the butter held and the eggs held, and Della sold a quilt she had pieced from feed sack scraps in the evenings to Ada Foss at the Mercantile, who took it for the window and paid $4 for it and asked, sharp-eyed over her spectacles, whether the Hollis woman would piece another. By the 1st of August it was 1070, because the black calf Della had pulled live in June had grown thrifty and strong, and she weaned it early off the heifer and sold it to a neighbor for the $12 she had promised that first morning it would be worth. By the middle of August it was 1040, and the creek was down to a string, and the far tank she had dug was the only standing water on the place, and the cattle, fat on the far grass nobody else had been able to give them water to reach, came to it morning and evening in a long patient line, and Silas Hollis sat his horse and watched them drink from the well his wife had found, and did not say what he was thinking, but Della knew it, because she was thinking it too. There was one more thing the ranch needed that summer, and it came to them by accident in the last week of July, and it was the making of Della Hollis in the eyes of every man who saw it. A black stallion came down out of the breaks above the creek, a wild stud horse running loose, a tall, ungentled 3-year-old with a white blaze and a temper that had been turned out or run off from somewhere up the valley and had gone half feral on the open range. He came down to the only standing water for miles, which was Della's tank, and he would not leave it, and he would not let a soul near it. And the first time Silas tried to rope him, the stud struck out with both forefeet and laid Silas's horse open across the shoulder, and near put Silas under the hooves. "Leave him," Silas said that night, his arm bound where the stud had grazed him. "He's killed before. I'd lay money. A horse like that's worth $40 broke and a funeral wild. We'll shoot him off the water if we have to." "You'll not shoot a $40 horse off my tank," Della said. "When $40 is most of what stands between us and October, you'll let me have him?" Silas looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Della, that stud put my gelding down. He'll kill a man, let alone a—" He stopped himself. "Let alone a fat woman." Della finished for him evenly. "Say it. It's true. I am one. And a fat woman is slow, which means I don't startle a horse the way a quick, nervous man does. I move like weather, Silas. Horses trust weather. You watch." She did not rope the stallion. She did not chase him or corner him or break him in the cruel, quick way the valley broke horses. She did the thing her father had done with the worst horse on the Mohawk farm, the patient old way the old horseman called gentling, that takes a week and the nerve to be still, Every morning and every evening, when the black stud came to the tank to drink, Della came too, and sat herself down on an overturned bucket 40 feet off with her broad back to him and a nosebag of bran in her lap, eating an apple, humming, paying him no mind at all, a large, unhurried, unfrightening shape on the ground that did not chase and did not flee and was simply, day after day, there. The first day, the stallion drank with his eyes rolled wide at her and bolted the moment he was done. The second day, he drank longer. By the fourth day, he drank and then stood, trembling, watching the strange, still woman who smelled of bran and apples and made no sudden thing. By the sixth day, he came a few steps toward the nosebag and snorted and wheeled away, and on the ninth morning, the black stallion that had near killed a man walked up to Della Mercer, where she sat on her bucket and put his soft nose into the bran in her lap, and let her, slow as sunrise, lay her broad, warm hand flat on his neck. Silas Hollis watched it from the corral rail with his hat in his hand. He watched a heavy woman the valley called Too Fat to last a winter gentle Achilles stud horse with nothing but stillness and bran and 9 days' nerve, and when she finally led the black stallion to the corral on a soft rope, walking slow with her hand on his neck, the horse following her like a dog, Silas did not say anything clever. He came and opened the gate for her, and after she had the horse inside and the gate shut, he stood very close to her in the dust and said, "Lo, I have never in my life seen anything like you, not once." "You weren't looking before," Della said, breathless, her hand still trembling from the held nerve of it. "People mostly aren't." "I'm looking now," Silas said, and he was, and they stood there a moment in the gold dust with the gentled horse blowing soft behind the rail, close enough that it would have taken nothing at all to close the rest of the way, and neither of them did, not yet, because there was still a debt and a count and a wall called October, and Della Hollis was a woman who finished a thing before she let herself have it. The black stallion, gentled, was worth $40 to any rancher in the valley, but Della would not sell him. "A horse like this you keep," she said. "He owes us nothing, and we owe him a home for the 9 days he didn't kill me. Besides, Silas needs a sound mount, his is laid up, and a $40 saddle horse we don't have to buy is the same as $40 to the good. It just doesn't go in the tin." So they kept the black horse, and Silas rode him, and the gentling of him ran Bent Fork faster than any butter ever had. It was a good summer for the ranch and a hard one for the valley, and that was the trouble that came next, and it did not come from Vane. It came from the sky. The drought that Della had dug ahead of broke every other rancher in the bottom, but the Lazy H. By the end of August, the creek had quit entirely, gone to cracked mud and a few stinking pools, and Cyrus Vane's bottom land, the bottom land that had wanted Silas Hollis's water for 3 years, dried up and curled brown, and Vane's own cattle began to gaunt and bawl on grass burned to powder, and every small rancher in the valley, the ones who had laughed on the bench outside the mercantile, the ones who had bet against the fat widow, watched their stock thin and their water vanish, and word went around Bent Fork, in the slow way word goes around a dying town, that the only standing water left for 10 miles was in a clay tank a heavy woman had dug by hand out of a dry corner on the Lazy H. They came to her. Of course they came to her. Men who had laughed at her in June came up the Lazy H road in August with their hats in their hands and their tongues thick with "How do you do?" to ask the woman they had mocked if she might, neighbor to neighbor, let them water a few head at her tank before the whole valley stock died on its feet. Della met them in the yard, every one of them, and what she did then was the thing that turned the valley, though no preacher could have done it better. She let them in. The first to come was a worn-down homesteader named Briggs, who rode up the Lazy H Road on a mule one morning in the last week of August with his hat already in his hand before he was off the animal, a man so ashamed of his errand he could hardly raise his eyes. Della was at the tank when he came, watching her own fat cattle drink, and she watched him work his courage up across the yard. "Mrs. Hollis," Briggs said, He stopped and started over, and his voice cracked on it. "My stock's dying, ma'am. 11 head and my children's milk cow, and not a drop of water from here to the river that ain't mud. I've got no right to ask. I was on that bench in June when Vane said what he said, and I didn't laugh, but I didn't stop him either, and I've been ashamed of it all summer, and now here I am, come to beg water off the very woman, and He ran dry. Della looked at him a long moment. She could have sent him off. There were women who would have, and no one in the valley would have blamed her, for the valley had earned nothing from her but mockery. But Della Mercer had stood where Briggs was standing, hat in hand, asking a thing she had no right to ask, more times in her life than she could count, and she knew exactly what it cost a proud man to do it, and she knew, too, the particular cruelty of making a man grovel for a thing you mean to give him anyway. "Mr. Briggs," she said, and she said it gently, "put your hat back on. The sun's fierce." She waited until he had. "You didn't laugh on the bench. I saw that you didn't. A man who won't join a cruelty even when it's easy is a man I'll water cattle for any day of the week." She nodded at the tank. "There's water enough if it's shared and not wasted. Bring them at noon when ours have had the morning. Don't foul the tank, don't crowd. And bring your children's milk cow, first of all. A child ought never go without milk while there's a cow alive to give it." She held his eye. "Bring your cattle, Mr. Briggs, and tell the others honest folk in your fix they can come too, on the same terms. I'll not have a beast die of thirst within a mile of standing water for the sake of who said what on a bench in June." Briggs stood there and turned his hat in his hands and could not speak for a moment, and then he said, thick, "There's not a soul in this valley deserves what you're doing, ma'am, least of all me." And Della said, "Deserving's got nothing to do with water, Mr. Briggs. Thirst doesn't ask a cow if it deserves to drink. Go on now and bring them at noon." There was a moment in the second week of the watering that the valley would tell for years. The widow Pratt, a tiny, dried-up woman of 70, who had buried a husband and 3 sons, and had nothing left in the world but one milk cow and a stubborn pride, came up the Lazy H Road last of all the neighbors, too proud to come and too desperate not to, and she would not ask. She just stood at the gate with her bony cow on a frayed rope and her chin up and her eyes wet, unable to say the words. And Della Mercer walked down to the gate and did not make her say them. She took the frayed rope out of the old woman's hand, gentle as anything, and said, "Mrs. Pratt, I've been hoping you'd bring her. I churn more butter than 2 people can eat, and I've nobody to give the buttermilk to, and a cow does poorly without buttermilk in a dry spell. You'd be doing me a kindness to let yours drink here and take the buttermilk home." It was not true. Della had 100 uses for buttermilk, but it let a proud old woman water her cow without breaking, and the widow Pratt knew it was a mercy dressed as a favor, And she looked at the heavy young woman a long moment and said in a cracked voice, "Cyrus Vane called you a thing I won't repeat on the bench in June. I'm ashamed I heard it and held my tongue." And Della said, "You hold your tongue all you like now, Mrs. Pratt, and bring your cow at noon, and we'll say no more about June." And the old woman brought her cow at noon every day after, and pieced quilts with Della on the cool evenings, and the two of them became, before the summer was out, the kind of friends that only the once lonely ever truly are. She watered Briggs's cattle and the Olsons' cattle and the widow Pratt's milk cow and a dozen other small herds through the worst 3 weeks of the drought, and she charged them nothing, not 1 cent. And she fed their children cornbread and butter off her own table while their father stood awkward and grateful at her well, and by the 2nd week of it there was not a soul in Bent Fork who would have let Cyrus Vane say a word against the Hollis woman in their hearing. She had done in 3 weeks of drought what Silas Hollis's grief had not let him do in 2 years. She had made the Lazy H the heart of the valley instead of its dying edge, and Cyrus Vane, watching his own bottom land curl and his own cattle gaunt, while the woman he had tried to burn out watered half the county for free, understood that he had lost the valley to her. And a man like Vane, when he loses a thing he means to own, does not become smaller. He becomes more dangerous. He played his last card in the 1st week of September, and it was the law, which is the card men like Vane keep up the sleeve for when the burning fails. Della was at the butter mold on a Tuesday morning when the rider came up the road. Not Vane this time, but a thin, nervous man in a town suit with a leather case, and behind him, at a distance, Cyrus Vane on his blood bay, come to watch. The thin man was a lawyer out of Cordell named Pruitt, the same Pruitt Della understood with a cold drop in her stomach, the land agent who had written her the letter, the man who had sold her west in the first place. He climbed down off his horse and would not meet her eye. "Mrs. Mercer," Pruitt said, and the name landed wrong, because she was Mrs. Hollis now, and he had said Mercer on purpose. "I'm afraid there's a difficulty with the deed to this land, and I've come to lay it before you and before Mr. Hollis." Silas came out of the barn with his hand near his hip, and Della put her own bandaged hand flat on his chest without looking at him, and he stopped. "Lay it out, then," Della said. Pruitt opened his case. "The deed to the Lazy H," he said, "the original deed of conveyance, was witnessed and recorded by my office at Cordell some years past, before Mr. Hollis's time, when his late brother purchased the property. It has come to light." He would not say from whom it had come to light, but Vane sat his horse 40 yards off, and Della did not need telling. That there is a defect in the recording, a missing signature. The deed, as recorded, is incomplete, and an incomplete deed conveys no clear title, which means, and here Pruitt finally looked up, because this was the part he had been paid to enjoy, that this land was never lawfully Mr. Hollis's to mortgage, and the notes against it may be called void, and the property reverts to the original grantor's estate, which, he swallowed, Mr. Vane has purchased the residual interest in. The yard was very quiet. Silas Hollis had gone the color of ash. $1,100 he could have fought 16 weeks at a time, a calf and a quilt and a pound of butter at a time. But a lawyer telling him the land had never been his at all, that the deed itself was a lie, was a blow he had no count to set against, and Della felt him sag beside her like a fence post, pushed past its lien. But Della Mercer had spent 14 months learning the inside of a dead man's papers, and she had read every document in the box on the kitchen table 4 times, and she had a memory like a ledger, and she did the thing that Cyrus Vane, for all his land and all his lawyers, had never once thought a fat butter woman could do. She read the lawyer back. "A missing signature," Della said slowly, "on the original deed of conveyance. The witness's signature, you mean, or the grantor's?" Pruitt blinked. The grantor's, on the second page of conveyance." "That's strange," Della said, "because there's a copy of that deed in the box in my kitchen. Mr. Hollis's brother kept his own copy, the way a careful man does, and I've read it through, second page and all, and the grantor's signature is on it, plain as my own hand. So either your office at Cordell recorded a defective copy by your own clerk's mistake, Mr. Pruitt, or somebody at your office took a pen to the recorded original sometime recently and scratched a signature out to make a defect where there wasn't one." She let that sit. "Now, which is it? Because the law's very particular, I'm told, about a man who alters a recorded deed. They call that forgery, and forgery to steal land is a thing they send a lawyer to the territorial prison for, and a cattleman with him, if the cattleman paid for it." Pruitt had gone gray. Out on the road, Cyrus Vane had stopped smiling. "I'd like to see this copy," Pruitt said faintly. "I'm sure you would," Della said. "You'd like to see it, so you'd know whether to burn my house down next, the way your friend tried to burn my grass." She did not raise her voice. "You'll see it in front of the territorial judge at Cordell, Mr. Pruitt, and not before, with my own lawyer beside it, and the recorded original beside that, so the judge can see for himself which one had a signature taken off it and how fresh the ink scrape is. A scrape shows, Mr. Pruitt. Fresh-cut paper shows pale. I expect a year-old defect and a 1-week-old defect look very different under a glass." She smiled at him then, the first time, and it was not a kind smile. "Ride back and tell Mr. Vane the deed's good, the copy's safe where he can't reach it, and the only thing his lawyer's lie has bought him is a witness, me, to put in front of a judge. The notes get paid the 1st of October. The land stays Hollis land, and if one more thing happens to this ranch, one fire, one sick cow, one defect that grows in the night, I will personally carry that copy and that scrap of red glove to the federal marshal at Cordell and let him decide which of you to hang first." She had no copy. There was no second copy of the deed in the box on the kitchen table. Della Mercer had read the notes, and the mortgage and the freight account 12 times, but the deed of conveyance itself she had never seen, and she did not know to this hour whether it had a defect or not. She had built the whole terrible bluff in the time it took Pruitt to open his leather case out of nothing but the certainty that a man who would forge a deed had something to hide and would not dare call her hand. And Pruitt, gray and sweating, folded his case shut and got back on his horse and rode out to the road and spoke to Cyrus Vane, and whatever he said Vane sat very still for a long moment and then turned his blood bay and rode away, and did not come back to the Lazy H again that summer. Silas Hollis turned to look at his wife as if he had never seen her before. "Is there a copy?" he said quietly. "No," Della said. "There never was." He stared at her, and then Silas Hollis, who had not laughed in 2 years, laughed once, a short, astonished bark of a thing, and put his hand over his mouth as if it had surprised him as much as her, and said, You bluffed Cyrus Vane and a Cordell lawyer off my land with a deed that doesn't exist." "I bluffed them with the truth they were afraid of," Della said. "The deed exists at the recorder's office, Silas, the real one. If they'd altered it, then everything I said is true, and they're cooked. And if they didn't alter it, if Pruitt was lying about the whole defect to scare us into selling cheap, then the deed's good, and we cooked their lie ourselves by refusing to flinch. Either way, the only wrong move was to be afraid. So I wasn't afraid." She set her hands on her broad hips. Silas was quiet a moment, looking at her the way a man looks at a thing he is only beginning to understand the size of. "Where," he said, "does a person learn to do that? To stand in her own yard with no cards in her hand and run a Cordell lawyer off the place with nothing but nerve? You learn it being poor and plain and a woman in a hard world," Della said simply, "when you got no money and no looks and no man behind you. Nerve is the only coin you're ever issued, Silas. And you learn to spend it careful and never let on how little of it you really got. I've been bluffing my way past men who'd have run me over my whole life. Pruitt's just the first one that ever paid to bluff." She picked up a churn paddle and put it in his hand. "Now, we've got near 4 weeks to October and $1,040 still to clear, and I have just spent the morning threatening a lawyer instead of churning. Help me with the butter." He helped her with the butter. They worked side by side at the churn and the mold in the warm kitchen, and somewhere in it, Silas stopped, mid-stroke, and looked at her, and said the thing that had been building in him since the burned field. "My wife Ruth," he said carefully, "was a small woman, quick and pretty and small. I loved her, and I buried her, and I'll not say a word against her, but I'll tell you a true thing, Della. She could not have done one single piece of what you've done this summer. Not the calf, not the well, not the fire, not the horse, not the lie you turned back on Pruitt. She'd have been frightened of all of it, and I'd have had to be brave for the both of us, and we'd have lost the land." He set down the paddle. "I spent 2 years thinking I'd buried the best of my life, and it turns out the best of my life came up my road in June with 1 bag and a debt that wasn't even hers, and I've been too stupid with grief to say so." Della kept churning, because if she stopped she would weep, and she had wept enough that summer. "That's a hard thing for a man to say about a dead wife and a live one," she said. "I'll not make you sorry you said it, but Silas, I didn't come here to take Ruth's place. There's no taking it. She's got her own place up on the rise under the cottonwood, and it's hers forever. I came here to make a new place, a Della place, next to hers, not on top of it." She wiped her eye with the back of her wrist. "A heart's not a chair where one body has to get up before another can sit. A heart's a table. You can set more than one place at it. Ruth's plate stays. You just lay another." Silas Hollis looked at the heavy, plain woman churning butter in his dead wife's kitchen, talking about hearts like tables, and something that had been clenched shut in him for 2 years came open all at once, and he had to turn away to the window for a moment and let it. When he turned back, his eyes were wet, and he did not pretend they weren't. "Then there's a place laid for you, Della Mercer," he said. "There has been since the calf. I just hadn't the nerve to call you to the table." "Call me when the debt's paid," Della said gently, and went back to her butter. "Not before. I'll not have you choosing me out of gratitude in a hard September. Choose me clear, or don't choose me at all. When that notice is paid and the deeds in your hand, and you can want a thing instead of needing it, then you call me to the table, and I'll come so fast I'll knock the chair over." And she smiled at him across the churn, wet-eyed and broad and entirely unafraid, and Silas laughed, the second laugh of the summer, and they finished the butter, and the count went on. And after that morning, Silas Hollis stopped looking at his wife as a thing that had cost him and started looking at her as the thing that had saved him, which is a different way of looking, and Della felt it on her like sun. The first 2 weeks of September were the hardest working weeks of the whole hard summer, because the cattle had to be made ready for the drive, and there were only the 2 of them and a borrowed dog to do it. They worked the herd from the dark before dawn to the dark after dusk, cutting the 42 finished steers out from the cows and the calves and the breeding stock, and it was dangerous close work on horseback in the dust, the kind of work that kills careless people, and Della was not careless. She rode the gentle black horse herself now, sitting him broad and easy, and the horse that had near killed a man worked cattle for her like he'd been born to it, and the valley men who had laughed in June rode past on the road and saw the fat widow cutting cattle off a half-wild stud she'd gentled with her own hands, and they did not laugh any more. There was a bad moment on the 10th of September that could have undone the whole summer. A steer broke from the cut and ran, and Della's black horse wheeled to head it, and as the horse spun a cinch that the drover boy had set careless, came loose, and the saddle turned, and Della Hollis, 270 pounds of her, went off the side of a running horse and hit the ground hard enough to drive the wind clean out of her, and lay in the dust with the cattle milling and the dust rising, and could not breathe. Silas was off his horse and across the ground before she had stopped rolling, on his knees in the dust, with his hands on her broad shoulders, his face white as bone, saying her name over and over, "Della, Della, breathe, please, breathe." And Della, fighting for the air that would not come, got one strangled whoop of it into her, and then another, and lay there gasping with Silas's arms around her, and the whole hard summer of held nerve breaking loose in him at once. "I thought," he said, and could not finish it. "When you went off, I thought, I know what you thought," Della wheezed, "and I'm not—" She got another breath. "I'm not going anywhere, Silas Hollis. It takes more than a turned saddle to put me down. There's too much of me to kill easy." And she laughed, winded and dusty and flat on her back in a cattle pen, and Silas Hollis put his forehead down against hers in the dust, and laughed too, shaking, and for a moment neither of them cared about the cattle or the count or October at all. Then Della said, "But that boy set my cinch loose and near killed me with it, so help me up, and let's go teach him to set a cinch, because a careless hand is the most expensive thing on a ranch." And Silas helped her up, and they went and taught the boy to set a cinch, and the work went on. The last month of the count was a hard climb, and they climbed it together. The fall cattle market at Cordell opened the 3rd week of September, and the drive was the whole ball game, because the cattle were the big money, and October was the wall. Della and Silas worked the herd from dark to dark, cutting the steers ready to sell from the cows and calves they would keep, doctoring the gaunt ones onto the last of the good far grass, and on the 18th of September they drove 42 finished steers the 2 days into Cordell, the 2 of them and a hired drover boy and a good dog, and Della Mercer rode the drag in the dust the whole way and did not complain of it once. The drive itself was 2 long days, and Della rode every mile of it. They pushed the 42 steers north and east toward Cordell through country gone gold and dry. Silas riding point on the gentle black horse, the drover boy and the dog working the flanks, and Della on the buckboard team riding the drag where the dust was worst and the work was meanest, hazing the slow steers and the footsore ones, eating grit the whole way and never once asking to trade places. The first night they camped on the open range, and Della cooked beans and bacon and skillet bread over a buffalo chip fire as easy as if she'd had a stove, and the drover boy, a 16-year-old named Tip, who had hired on cheap and skeptical, ate 3 plates and said, around the last of it, "Mrs. Hollis, you cook like that on the trail, and I'll drive cattle for you for free." And Della laughed for the first time all summer, a big warm laugh that startled the horses, and said, "You'll be paid your dollar, Tip, and fed besides. I don't take a man's work for nothing. I've had mine taken too often to do it to another soul." They brought the herd into the Cordell stockyards on the morning of the second day, dusty and lean and triumphant, and the steers sold. Because they had grown fat on water no other rancher in the valley had been able to reach, the Lazy H steers were the best finished cattle on the Cordell market in a drought year when every other man's beef was thin. The cattle buyer, a stout man named Hargrove in a checked vest, walked the pens with his thumbs in his pockets and stopped at the Lazy H steers and walked them twice, and turned to Silas and said, "These yours? In this year? Where in this whole dry territory did you grow beef like this?" And Silas Hollis, who 2 years had not been able to say a proud word, jerked his thumb at the heavy woman on the rail and said, "My wife found water nobody else could find and dug a well by hand to reach it. That's where." And Hargrove looked at Della Hollis on the rail in her dusty blue dress, and took off his hat to her, which a Cordell cattle buyer did for almost no one, and bid the steers up, and the other buyers, seeing Hargrove want them, bid them up further, for fat beef was scarce as gold in a drought year, and these were the fattest on the rail, and 42 steers that would have brought $12 apiece thin brought $24 apiece fat in the scarce market. And Della stood at the rail of the stockyard and watched the buyer write the figure, and did not let herself believe it until the cash was in her hand. $1,008, 42 head at $24, $1,008 in greenbacks and gold, counted into Della Mercer's broad palm at the Cordell stockyards on the 20th of September, and she folded it into the money belt under her dress and put her hand flat over it and breathed once, the way she had breathed the night of the fire, and looked at Silas across the pens, and saw that he was looking at her with his whole heart in his weathered face, and not hiding it any more. The count before the drive had stood at 1,040 owed, for the dairy and the quilt and the calf had nibbled the great debt down slow all summer, while the cattle fattened toward this one day. 1,040 owed less 1,008 from the steers was 32 still owing. $32 between the Lazy H and the Clear, and 11 days, and the last of the dairy to do it with. Della churned and sold one more round of butter and eggs in those 11 days, and brought the count down one more dollar to 31, and then there was nothing left big to sell, and she counted it out on the kitchen table the night before the last, and laid it bare. $1,109 raised against $1,140 owed. $31 short, and Della did not pretend otherwise. $31 short, she said. 1,140 owed, 1,109 raised. $31, and we've sold the steers, and there's nothing left big to sell. She looked at the cracked daguerreotype over the mantel, the young, dead wife in her wedding collar. Unless. Unless what? Silas said. Unless we sell something I swore I'd never ask you to sell. Della stood and went to the box of papers and lifted out, from beneath them, the thing she had found in the bottom of the box weeks ago and never spoken of. A small leather pouch, and in it a man's heavy gold pocket watch, scrolled and fine, the kind of watch a freighter or a brother brings back from a good year. Your brother's watch. It's gold. Ada Foss would give $35 for it Saturday, maybe $40. It'd clear the 31 and leave us a little over. She set it on the table between them, gently, the way you set down a thing that hurts to touch. I won't sell it without you. It's the last of him. But it's a watch, Silas, and the land is the land. And I think your brother would rather you kept his land than his watch. That's what a brother is. Silas Hollis picked up his dead brother's watch and turned it over in his calloused hand, and for a moment the grief came up in his face the way it must have come up every day for 2 years, and Della let it come and did not rush him, because she had buried Tom Mercer, and she knew that grief will not be hurried and must not be shamed. And then Silas closed his hand over the watch and said, in a steady voice, "We'll sell it Saturday. He'd want the land kept. You're right." And he set it back in the pouch and put the pouch in Della's hand and closed her bandaged fingers over it the way she had closed his over the scrap of red glove, and said, "But I'm not selling it to be short by $31. I've got a thing to add to the count that I've been keeping back because I wasn't sure of it, and now I am." He went out to the barn in the dark and came back with a coffee tin furred with rust, and out of the coffee tin he counted onto the table, in old worn coins, $52 in silver and gold that he had buried in the barn floor 2 years ago, against the day he could not stand the loss any more, and meant to ride away from all of it. Money he had saved to run with and never spent, because the leaving had felt like a worse betrayal than the staying. "I was going to use it to leave," Silas said. "Now I'm using it to stay. $52. That clears the 31 and then some, and we keep my brother's watch." He pushed the worn coins across the split table into the lamplight. "Count it, Della. You count everything. Count us clear." And Della Mercer counted it, the silver and the gold and the greenbacks and the butter tin, slow, out loud, with her bandaged finger moving down the pile the way her mother had taught her to count anything she was afraid of. And when she reached the end of it, the count was $1,161 in hand against $1,140 owed. And she set her finger down on the table and looked up at the man she had married for a roof and stayed with for something else entirely, and she said the number she had been climbing toward since the 9th of June. $21 over, Della said, and her voice broke on it, the only time it broke in the whole long summer. "We're clear, Silas. We're clear, and 21 to the good. The 1st of October can come whenever it likes." They rode into Bent Fork together. On the last Saturday of September, the buckboard team brushed, and the gentled black horse tied on behind, and Della wore the deep purple dress, and on the seat between them sat the strong box with the count in it. Word had gone ahead because Della had let it go ahead. She had told Ada Foss at the Mercantile the Wednesday before, knowing exactly how fast a thing travels out of Ada Foss's hearing, that the Hollises would be paying the Lazy H note in full on the courthouse steps Saturday at noon, and would be obliged for the company. The company came. By noon there was a crowd in front of the Cordell Bank's branch office at the Bent Fork Courthouse such as the town had not gathered since the railroad surveyor came through. Briggs and his wife and his 4 children, the Olsons, the widow Pratt, Tip the drover boy, Ada Foss in her best shawl, and behind them, drawn the way people are always drawn to watch a thing fall a stand half the valley. And at the back, on his blood bay horse, not dismounting, Cyrus Vane, come to watch the fat widow fail to make the count, because a man like Vane cannot stay away from the thing he has wagered against any more than a tongue can stay out of a sore tooth. The bank's clerk set up his table on the courthouse steps and opened his ledger, and Della Hollis climbed down off the buckboard with the strong box in her 2 broad hands. And she did not hurry, and she did not perform. She simply walked up the steps in her purple dress and set the box on the clerk's table and opened it. $1,140, she said loud enough for the steps and the street, owed by the Lazy H to the Cattlemen's Bank of Cordell, due the 1st of October. It's the 29th of September. We've come to pay it. And she counted it out onto the clerk's table in front of the whole town, the steer money, and the butter tin, and the egg cup, and the brothers' barn-buried silver, slow, out loud, in her plain, steady voice, the same way she had counted it down all summer, so the fear could not run ahead of her. And the crowd counted with her under their breath, and the clerk wrote each number in his ledger, and when Della laid the last coin down, the clerk added his column twice to be sure, and looked up and said, in the carrying voice of a man who knows he is part of a story now, "Paid in full. The Lazy H owes the Cattlemen's Bank of Cordell not 1 cent. The crowd let out a sound then, a low, glad roar, and Briggs's 4 children cheered outright. And Ada Foss put her sharp face into her shawl and wept. And at the back of it all, Cyrus Vane sat his blood bay in a silence so complete it had its own weight, and then turned the horse and rode out of Bent Fork at a walk, slow, so it would not look like fleeing, which is exactly how a man rides when he is fleeing, and will not give the crowd the running. They had paid the Cattlemen's Bank of Cordell its $1,140 on the courthouse steps, where Cyrus Vane had meant to buy the land for the price of a grieving man's sorrow, and they had paid it in front of the whole town, because Della had let it be known they were coming, and the whole town came to watch the fat widow Vane had tried to burn out, lay $1,140 on the clerk's table, and take up in exchange the clear deed to the Lazy H, with no defect on it, 2nd page and all. The recorder swore it himself with his hand on the book, for the deed had been good the whole time, and Pruitt's defect had been a lie from the first word, and the bluff had been the truth, and Cyrus Vane had run from the truth because he had not known it was the truth, and that is the whole shape of how a small, brave woman beats a great, wicked man. She refuses to be afraid of a lie. The clerk handed Della the deed. Silas had asked him quietly, the week before, to draw it new. And when Della unfolded it there on the courthouse steps in front of Bent Fork, she saw that it was made out in 2 names, not 1. Silas Hollis and Della Hollis, jointly and in equal right, owners in full of the Lazy H, the land and the water, and the far tank, and the clear creek, free of all debt and all claim. "You put my name on the deed," Della said. "I put your name on the deed," Silas said. He took his brown hat off then, on the courthouse steps, in front of the whole town, which is a thing a frontier man does at a funeral or a wedding, and almost nowhere else. And he stood bareheaded in the September sun with his gray-streaked hair flat from the band, and he said the thing he had been 2 years learning how to say and 3 months sure of. I sent for a pair of hands because I was too broke and too sorrowful to send for anything more, and what came up my road was the best person I ever knew, and I had spent the whole summer too proud and too scared to say it plain, so I'm saying it plain on the steps where I'd have lost everything without you. You belong on this land, Della. Your name belongs on this paper, and I'd be honored past my deserving if you'd let it belong there as my wife in truth and not just in Pruitt's letter, for as long as we both get to keep counting. Della Mercer stood on the courthouse steps with the clear deed in her 2 bandaged hands, the deed with her own name written across it in the recorder's good black ink, and she looked at the lean, weathered man holding his hat against his chest, and at the town that had laughed at her in June and stood silent and shamed and admiring now, and she did the arithmetic one last time, the only sum that had ever really mattered, the one she had stopped letting herself do a long time ago, the worth of a heavy, plain, dismissed woman in a world that had measured her by the pound her whole life and found her wanting. The answer this time was that she was worth a man's whole heart and half of everything he owned, and her name on the deed in ink, and she let herself believe it. "Put your hat back on, Silas Hollis," Della said, smiling, with the tears running plain down her broad face, and not one of them ashamed. "You'll burn that bald spot in this sun, and I've grown fond of it. Yes, in truth and not in any letter. Yes." He put his hat back on, and he kissed his wife on the courthouse steps in Bent Fork in front of everyone, the fat butter woman they had bought by the pound and bet against and tried to burn, the woman who had dug them all a well and watered the whole valley through a killing drought and faced down Cyrus Vane with a deed that didn't exist and a count that only went one way, and the town did not laugh, because the town had finally learned what Silas Hollis had learned in a burned field at midnight, that there is no measuring a person by what they weigh, only by what they carry, and Della Hollis had carried the whole of it and never once set it down. There is a thing I should tell you about Cyrus Vane, because you have been patient and you have earned the end of it. He did not come back to the Lazy H, but the valley remembers what it remembers, and a town that has watered its cattle at your well is a town that does not forget who tried to burn it. When the next county election came round in the spring, the small ranchers Della had carried through the drought, Briggs and Olson and the widow Pratt and a dozen more, remembered the red glove and the lawyer's lie and the fire in the dry grass. And they remembered, too, whose water had kept their children fed, and Cyrus Vane, who had run that valley by debt and fear for 10 years, found that there was not a man left in it who would sell him a steer or shake his hand or sign his petition, and within 2 years he had sold out his great dry spread for a poor price and gone, and the bottom land that had wanted Silas Hollis's water came up in time for sale on the courthouse steps, and it was Della Hollis who bought it, clear in cash, off the back of 10 good years of butter and beef and a well that never failed. She kept the scrap of red glove. She kept it in the box with the deed, the clear deed in 2 names, and on winter evenings when the children she and Silas raised on that land asked her why a torn red glove lived in the strong box with the most important paper in the house, Della Hollis would take it out and turn it over in her broad, capable hands and tell them the truth, which she had never once in her life been afraid of. "Because a man told me what I weighed," she would say, "and I showed him what I carried. Now go count the eggs and bring me the number, and do it out loud so the fear can't run ahead of you." That is the story of Della Mercer, who came up a dusty road with one bag and a debt that was not even her own, whom 3 men measured by the pound and found wanting, and who paid off $1,140 in 16 weeks, with a soldered milk pail and a hand-dug well and a bluff and a brother's watch. She did not have to sell after all, and took her name onto the deed and her place in a hard man's whole heart, and proved to a valley that watched her do it that worth was never once about what she weighed. It was about what she refused to let fall, and it never fell.